Welcome back to Down to Earth. We're really excited to have you join us today, and we're excited to continue this journey, Uncle Marty, that we've been on. And I know I at least have a really important question for you today, but just welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here as well. And I heard you had some exciting things this weekend, Caleb. Maybe you could share with us.
Yeah, it was a blast. So I went out to North Carolina to visit my uncle, and on Sunday, we actually got to go to the drag race in Charlotte and watch these Top Fuel drag race cars go down the track. Something like 10 to 12,000 horsepower or something.
Oh, man.
And they're going over 300 miles an hour.
I didn't even know cars could go that fast.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And
are these regular sized vehicles or are these extended?
They'd probably be twice as long as the stage here.
Okay.
And then when they go by, it's just like it's shaking so much, like your vision is almost shaking following the car down the track. And so it's just an incredible amount of power.
Well, I'm gonna not to down you guys' fun car talk here, but let's get down to business. Yeah. I have a question for you.
Yes, Melissa.
At least for me, I've grown up with a lot of Muslim friends. I work quite a bit with your wife, working with refugees and Muslims here in the States. And for me, it's just part of life. And there's good and there's bad, just like there are with every people group. But you end up meeting so many wonderful people. But I think the question that I get asked probably the most by people who have never had any contact with Muslims at all is, why would you want to do that? Aren't they all terrorists? I mean, everything's just horrible. And those people exist. Very, very much so. But maybe for our audience today, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about just that dynamic, because I feel like we've talked a lot about the good parts, and we've talked about Muslims looking for Jesus, people having hearts of service, finding out where God's already working. But there's a lot of bad that's going on too, and there's a lot of terrorist activity. We hear all about it in the news. And so there's a lot of heartbreaking stuff happening, and then we hear a lot of good stories. Maybe you could delve into that a little bit for us today.
Sure, Will. In no way do I want to downplay the issues that are at stake. You know, we have all seen the atrocities of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS, and, you know, many of the refugees coming to this country were actually fleeing ISIS, who were Muslims themselves. So while ISIS really attacked the Christian community and many Christians had to leave the areas where ISIS came into, with the Druze in Iraq, the people who really suffered the most, and the largest group, were other Muslims who said, we can't share in this. Well, if you can't share, you either have to flee or join us. So thousands and millions of people left. We saw the news here back some time ago of people just fleeing in boats, you know, coming across to Greece, going into Europe. And so there has been a major disaster. I don't think this is a large percentage. The percentage is small, but a very powerful, very well-trained, a very vocal group of people who really make it to the top of the news and who create a lot of sadness and heartbreak in their path and in their trail.
And with any group of people, you're bound to, well, maybe not bound, but you end up reading through history, at least, you end up with extremists. And Islam does have a lot of extremist groups like you were talking about, like ISIS. I know for my sister, she spent 2 years working in Lebanon directly with Syrian refugee kids, and just watching the hurt that came out from these kids fleeing from their homes. And the hearts of the people that she worked with, the families that took care of her, they would have, I mean, they gave literally the shirts off their back to somebody in need. They were such wonderful people. My sister doesn't usually even sleep with a pillow. She's not a pillow person, she just sleeps. But one of the refugee families she was working with found out that she didn't have a pillow, and they literally went and made sure to buy her a pillow versus getting something that they could have used, because Tammy needed a pillow and they wanted to make sure she was very well taken care of. And so, at least with my interactions, so many of these wonderful people who have such good hearts searching for God, and who show me a perspective of God that often I don't see. I know I've learned a lot just networking with the Muslims that I work with here in our little refugee community, of how to just see God as something bigger. Because often I think we put God in a box. But for a lot of people, they don't get to see that side.
It's true. So as you're saying, you know, there is definitely good people, wonderful people, and I'd say that's the majority. There's a problem that I think that stands at the very core is revenge. In how you resolve conflict. And so people pass this anger, and revenge builds up. And how do you take back your honor? How do you resolve things is with more violence. And so if you can't build a large army, to take what you think is done, then people resort to other tactics. And while I don't in any way agree with those, sometimes we can understand some of the situations.
Yeah, I just know in my personal life, after 9/11 and growing up in a small town in Colorado and being, isolated from other cultures, definitely had a skewed view towards Muslims. And then moving out here and being able to interact with some of these refugees and having some of them over to our house, 2 families in particular come to mind that were from a Middle Eastern country and they're here as refugees now. And, I tried to have the love of Jesus before they came and, not have any preconceived notions or anything, but still in the back of your mind, that's still there. But then in talking to them, they want the same things that we do. They want, a good life, an easy life. They want, to have a good house and support their family. They want their kids to have good education. That their wants and desires for their family is not, at least with the people that I've interacted with, they're not any different than any of the rest of us. And so I think it can be easy to demonize a people, paint a broad brushstroke based on the experience with a few people or bad experience with some.
Absolutely, and I would say, Caleb, that's the majority of Muslims. While there is definitely a 0.005% that are fundamentalists who would do terrorist acts and who have filled the news and made a lot of us fear situations. So those things are very real and very scary.
So speaking about terrorists and this sort of thing, do you have, you've worked extensively in the Middle East and with Muslims in general. Have you come across any experiences with a terrorist or anything like that?
Well, I have actually had one time a situation where I was very scared with my family. Before my kids were born, we had gone to a village we didn't know was a fundamentalist village. We came into it. There was an ancient church that was going to be pulled down, but all of a sudden people didn't know who we were. Our car was surrounded, and it was a pretty scary situation to get out. But not looking just at myself, God protected us there, and that would be a very rare occasion for something like that to happen. I've never felt fear before or after that situation of having traveled extensively. I did have a friend, his name is Rodney, and he had a unique experience. I'd just like to share a little bit about Rodney. One time he received a phone call, and it was the leadership of a very large, prominent mosque.
Rodney's an Adventist?
He's an Adventist,
Okay.
yeah, he's an Adventist.
And is he here in the U.S. or?
He lives in Australia.
Okay.
He's Australian, but he's between the U.S. and Australia, traveling back and forth.
Okay.
And I would really like to ask prayers for him. He has suffered with cancer recently. He's also had 2 anthrax poisonings.
Oh, wow.
We don't know how those happened. 2 different variants of anthrax in about the last 18 months. And I'm just really asking for prayers that God will take care of him. God has used him in a very powerful way to meet influential Muslims all around the world. And I asked one time, Rodney, you tell everyone you're a farmer. Why is it that you feel more comfortable with a billionaire than with other farmers? What's going on here? Why is influential people always calling you and doing this? There's something. You're not a typical farmer, and I don't look down or don't misunderstand me. And I said, Rodney, tell me. And he never told me. I said, Rodney, this time you got to tell me. Why is this? You say you're a farmer, and yeah, you're a farmer, and you have a larger farm than most farmers. And so he says, well, I'll tell you. My dad wasn't a wealthy man, but he was well off, but he wanted me to be well educated. And so he sent me to the most expensive, most refined, most Ivy League school he could possibly afford, which was the very best in our country. And so during that time, I learned a lot. It had an effect on me, and also many of the people in power in my country today, both in industry and politics, in the different arenas, are all very close friends of mine.
Went to school together.
We went to school together, so I says, now I understand, Rodney. Now this starts to make sense with me. But getting into our story, Rodney receives this phone call. It's a big, large mosque here in the U.S., and they say, we're so sorry to bother you, Rodney, but would you be willing to come here and meet with someone? And he says, well, tell me, who do you want to meet with? And they said, well, we don't know if we should tell you on the phone. There's an incident, we have a problem, it's very important. The family have heard about you and they have begged, would you please come?
So you have people from a mosque begging
This is a big influential mosque in this country.
for Rodney to come and speak to somebody.
Yes.
Okay.
And so Rodney says, ask him, why do you want me to come? Why me? And they says, well, we know that you know how things end up here on earth. And you know the beginning of things, how things started. And Rodney says, please tell me more. Well, just trust us. We will pay for your trip. You come see us.
Wow.
So says Rodney, okay, I trust you. He comes, he visits them, and they says, look, we have an incident on our hands. There's a family begging us to please find a solution. They have a son who's been radicalized, and he's ready to take off next week to join ISIS. The family are crying for him. We wanted just to call the FBI to come pick him up. The family were saying, isn't there any way you can talk him out of these fundamentalist radical ideas? And Rodney says, why do you think I can do it? They says, well, we already told you on the phone. You know how things end. You're a follower of Jesus, and we believe you can help us.
Mm-hmm.
So basically they're saying, you can help us figure out how to get to this guy because you see the bigger picture.
Because you see the bigger picture. And we just felt impressed as the mosque committee, we need to call you. The family have begged us not to call the FBI yet. They're the ones who told us the problem. And they said if we can't resolve it, then immediately call the FBI and inform them. So the mosque was wanting to do the right thing, and so they says, please, would you please talk to this young man? And he says he's not an easy guy. He's so radicalized, he doesn't even want to see any Caucasian Americans, you know. He's very angry. But we believe that somehow you will touch him. Rodney thinks, should I do this? This is dangerous. Who knows who this person is? And Rodney sends back the message to the family. He will meet with him. The young man says, I will meet with him in the Walmart parking lot. So they go to the parking lot. Now because the young man's also afraid that maybe he's turned in and he's going to be grabbed by the FBI or CIA or something. But finally, Rodney waits and waits. 20 minutes go by, 30 minutes go by. Is this guy going to show up? Finally, he sees someone slither up. Finally, the young man arrives, and Rodney says, are you so-and-so? And he says, I am. And he says, I'm not here to criticize you. I'm here to listen. So somehow the young man just relaxed and started spewing all this anger he had. He says, you don't know what it's like. You know, the U.S. talks about collateral damage. My own family, many to get one, they kill 50 in the process with collateral damage with a drone attack. And I've just been building up more anger. And he told story after story. And after 45 minutes of spewing the anger, and many of these things very correctly, Rodney says, I don't have any argument with what you're sharing. Many of the stories, I can feel your pain. I can feel your frustration. So Rodney asked him, tell me a bit about yourself. Well, I'm so old. He was already in his mid-30s. I have a child. I have a wife. And then he's very quick to say, but I'm willing to give up my life so that my daughter will have a better life. And my kids. Rodney thought, Lord, I don't know how to answer this young man. I don't know what to tell him. He says, talk to him about what it means to be a kingdom follower of Jesus and how you resolve conflict. Tells the young man, you know what? I agree with everything you say, but more violence only results in more violence. To resolve violence, you can't. But he says, how can we resolve? He says, let me share with you how Jesus. But I don't want to listen to you. You're a Christian. Listen, he says. I think Jesus has a message for us today. And he starts to read to him the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the peacemakers. And as he was reading, blessed are the peacemakers, Rodney could see a softening in his face. And Rodney starts to open to him the story of Jesus coming to start a kingdom of peace that turns the world upside down. And to make a long story short, as he shared the Sermon on the Mount with the young man, his heart starts to crumble. And he wants to know more, and he asks, how do things end? And Rodney starts to share with him our Adventist understanding of the great controversy of how things end and how things started. And the young man ends by saying, wow, Jesus is the way to resolve these problems. His way is so much more powerful. And he says real jihad, because the Quran makes this distinction that real jihad isn't violence, isn't fight, but it's a thing about self-control in our own lives. And Rodney says that's true, and the way I see it is that good overcomes evil always. To make a long story short, the young man thanked him, came up and gave Rodney this big bear hug, kissed him on one side, Arab style, kissed him on the other side, Arab style, and said, you have saved me and my family's life. Because I'm sure, I was thinking I was going to get away, but as you were talking, it just hit me. I'm going to go to the airport and the FBI is going to be picking me up. I won't even make it. And if I do, what is all that violence going to bring you? Are so right. Today, that young man has become a peace activist because Rodney was willing to step out of his comfort zone and come and say, let me show you Jesus' way.
Sheesh. It's really stepping out of your comfort zone then. I don't know if I would have had the courage that Rodney had to say, sure, I'll come meet with somebody who's interested in joining a terrorist organization.
You know, that's not everyday experience, but I have another story as well. Rodney works with one of his best friends, who is Paul Bennett's.
Okay.
And they have their own Ampha Club or...
Yeah, I've emailed quite a bit with Paul. We've talked back and forth just a little bit about what they're trying to do in Australia and what we're doing here. And we have a Bible study that meets every other week where we kind of go over understanding biblical principles and also coordinating that with the Quran and helping my volunteers understand how to make spiritual applications, as it were, during everyday conversation as they're mingling with and befriending a lot of the refugees that we work with. And so we record those and I send them to Paul because Paul doesn't have that there.
Yes.
But he seems like a really cool guy.
He is. I really enjoy being with Paul. I've stayed in his home with him and his wife, and he kind of oversees and is building a whole network of Ampha clubs across the country.
Now, I don't think we've ever brought up Ampha here on
Well, maybe
set
you could
before.
just share a little bit what that is, since you're strongly involved with that.
Well, Ampha is actually an initiative out of the NAD to help enable Adventist lay people to understand how to network with Muslims. And so it's something your wife started. And
I don't know if she started, but
well,
she inherited
she
something.
inherited it from a lot of people. She's the one who actually helped get it to go nationwide. Let's put it that way.
Exactly.
And so now that it's an NAD initiative, even though it was originally started by lay people just in one little town trying to figure out a way to make this happen, that template and format has been carried out as an initiative through the NAD.
That's true.
And it's been really cool to see the different little Ampha, Adventist Muslim Friendship Association chapters, as we call them, pop up across just the NAD, and now work starting in Australia, and so that's really cool.
So yeah, Paul is working with this, and he and Rodney really work very closely together, and he really oversees work across Australia. But maybe 2 or 3 years ago, him and his wife take a vacation, and they go to Indonesia, and one Sabbath they end up at one of the churches in a far-flung area of the country. And there's a friendly person there, and they start talking after church. Who are you? What do you do? And he starts sharing, well, I'm a school teacher. And they ask each other what each one is doing. And Paul says, well, I'm actually a builder, remodeling. I flip houses from time to time, shares a little bit what he does. And he asks the teacher, Ferry, what do you do? And he says, well, I'm an Adventist school teacher. I teach Bible and other classes. But my real passion, as you were sharing with me as well, is to work with Muslims. And the two men can't believe it. They were just brought together after church talking, and Ferry says there's been a lot of violence in our country against Christians, and Christians then as well retaliate.
I know growing up in Nigeria, at least in northern Nigeria, you'd often have little skirmishes, I guess you could say, between Christians doing something to a mosque and then the Muslims coming to do something to the church, and just back and forth. And it was just this ongoing violence string where people couldn't just step back and say, well, what is God's way? What is Jesus' way? How do we resolve this conflict?
And this is what Ferry asked. He was saying enough is enough, because in their country this was just ongoing. It was getting worse and worse. Churches were scared because they were a minority, but at the same time they kept retaliating. While our Adventists didn't retaliate, they were a part of this big mess. And Ferry kept saying there needs to be a better way. So he kept taking more and more time from his teaching, and he was traveling from mosque to mosque doing this same thing, building reconciliation. Places where he would have been scared to go, he comes and starts building friendships. And before long, he has a whole network of mosques that are inviting him to come and share. And he comes and he shares, first of all, things that we have in common, invites them to start these dialogues between them, and Ferry hardly has any more time
To teach.
to teach. So Paul just says, well, Ferry, I don't know how we're going to do it, but me and my wife are going to help you.
So pretty much there on the spot, Paul hears a story and says, hey, we're going to find a way to sponsor you to basically be a lay missionary, I guess you could say.
Exactly.
So that you don't have to teach, but you can help do these peace-building exercises?
Exactly. So they stepped out and
Quite a
faced them.
financial choice
I wasn't
right
there, but just knowing the family, I can imagine his wife is looking, what are you saying, Paul? You know, we're not rich, we make a living, but how are you going to support him? And the man is then saying, well, there's 2 other teachers that this is their lifelong passion with me. We really need to be 3.
So it's just gone to 3 now.
To 3. And Paul is now, what do I do? And his wife was looking at him and says, well, I don't know, but God's going to make a way for this to happen. Somehow Paul's been helping them, and Ferry and his team have just built a wider and wider network of mosques. They go around to the churches, much like these amphi-teams, and they talk to the churches about adopting a local mosque and building these friendship associations, and it's just amazing what is happening in the country. They're seeing just this whole level of violence drop, and people aren't fighting each other anymore. And now instead of eyeing each other with hatred, with envy, with problems, with revenge, now they're dialoguing. And so it's just been really beautiful to see, and Ferry calls Paul and tells him updates, and Paul calls him back. They kind of dream together how they're going to keep expanding this network and the relationships, and it's just been amazing. One mosque after another said, could you come and share the Sermon on the Mount about Jesus' teachings in our mosque? We want to hear it. Our people desperately need these values, the kingdom values.
As you're talking about these values, it feels like, at least from my experience, which is very limited, and from the stories that we've heard just through the last couple of seasons, is that Muslims tend to notice a couple of key things about followers of Jesus that draws them to just ask, who are you? What would you say those couple of things are?
Well, it's interesting that you asked this, Melissa, because actually the Quran gives some indicators of how to recognize who followers of Jesus are and who are the right followers of Jesus. And so, for example, one of the things it says, those who believe in that which is forbidden. And that is basically clean and unclean meats, as well as alcohol and so forth. Those who believe in the last day, which is the day of judgment, the second coming of Jesus. And then there's another very key text that indicates towards followers of Jesus. It says that God gave his spirit to Jesus, and Jesus' followers, this is in Surah 57:27, says that they will show this almost spiritual thing of compassion and mercy. And so this is what I see why people called Rodney. This is why people are seeing in the life of Ferry, will you come and teach this? Because they're recognizing this kindness that they have. They're recognizing these fruits of the Spirit. And I think, you know, we've been talking about this almost supernatural growth of what we're seeing in the house church movement. I think this has been very fundamental across. People see a life-transforming change because we have heard this over and over, this reoccurring theme, we want to be like you. What we see is that when people are transformed, it's not just a head thing that happens, but it's this heart transformation. They see the fruits of the Spirit as we see in Galatians 5. You know, that you will feel peace, you will feel joy, you're going to show kindness, you're going to show love.
Long-suffering, gentleness,
long-suffering,
faithfulness.
gentleness, faithfulness, and all of a sudden you start seeing these fruits of the Spirit lived out in people's lives. People say, I want to be like them. If you can feel this type of peace, if you show this type of mercy, this type of compassion to the people who are undeserving, and this is what's happened with the Muslims that Ferry's been working with. We were the mosque that came and did violence to your church or to the church of other Christians, and you stepped out of your comfort zone to come and talk with us. We want to also have that forgiveness that you have, that mercy, that compassion that you have, and we want to be a part of that.
And I think during our networking with Muslims and refugees in our area, one of the key things that I've noticed and had to bring out to our volunteers especially is that people recognize what your intentions are. And when you come with a heart of service and allow yourself to be completely emptied and filled with God and are willing to say, hey, I am somebody who desires your good. I'm not here with an agenda. I just want to show you love. I want to show you compassion. I want to show you that there is a God who is a God of second chances and of mercy. And you come with that as your pure motive and just say, hey, I want to be there for you. I want to show you the love that Jesus has showed me. It does powerful things.
It really, really does.
Opens people's hearts in ways that you could never do otherwise.
It's true.
It's a hard thing for some of us, though.
It is. Well, I think we've kind of gone over our time, and I don't know if Caleb, you'd like to finish us with a prayer.
Definitely. Let's have a prayer. Dear God, thank you for today, and I just pray specifically for Rodney and Paul and the ministries that they have, and their financial situations there, and Ferry as well. And just thank you for the story of this young man who is now a peace activist, and these incredible stories that show us what the fruit of the Spirit is capable of doing against the kingdom of darkness. And so I pray that you open our minds to that and show us how to live with those fruits in our lives. Thank you for hearing and answering our prayers. In your name, amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys again next time here at Down to Earth.